Hello and welcome to another online lesson, this one from the Elizabethan England course in the GCSE. Another social study really, this one, a little delve into society in Elizabethan England, similar to the education lesson. What did these people do for fun, for leisure in this period? Lots are similar to today, lots absolutely not. So just to consider, again, as with all of these features in Elizabethan society, almost anything that you could do related on how rich you were, if you're a boy, a girl, a man, a woman. So this was the same in leisure and entertainment. Status and your place in society dictated everything. Very, very rarely, if ever at all, would you be able to mix the classes. They may be in the same place, as we'll see in this lesson, but absolutely not going together. All right, as well as gender, that would also play a part. So the easiest way to make notes on this lesson is to devise a table like the one you can see here. As we go through the lesson, if you fill in the activity, was it for upper classes, lower classes, men and or women? Okay, and by the end of it, hopefully this table will be filled in and we can use this. Try to include as much detail as you can, and we'll use that for a little features practice at the end of the lesson. Okay, so let's begin. So first of all, to understand, just like today, there are different things that we can do for fun and for entertainment. The first ones we're going to look at in this lesson are participation pastimes. So basically things you could physically do, things you could actually play, as opposed to later we'll see activities that you watch. So let's start with sports for the nobility and the upper classes only. Firstly, real tennis. So as you can see, it looks like tennis, what we might see today at Wimbledon or out on the grass or clay, but it's indoor. It's basically a place to show off, really. There's rules similar to, I suppose it's a hybrid between tennis and squash today, but it was really important to show off status and wealth. Probably the most famous real tennis court in the country is in Hampton Court Palace. So you may have been to see that. If not, look out for it if you ever do visit there. And this would be a pastime for men only. Okay, rich men, upper class men. I'm sure poor people might create something similar as happens today, but the access to the real tennis courts, indoor places where they do it, would be for the rich only. So you can see in the little introduction there at the top that the balls could bounce off the walls as long as they didn't go above a certain limit. Otherwise this was out. There's scores on the walls for where your ball lands as well. Very often Henry VIII would play real tennis, as would most nobles. I suppose you'd have to make sure that he won that way to not suffer the wrath of the king. So that's the first one you can fill in on your table. So men only, upper class only. And then the next one, we'll move on swiftly, is fencing. This today is very much a pastime of the elite. I feel like you might see this in some grammar schools or private schools. It's not something that we partake in comprehensive schools, and generally I would say quite confidently that it's not something that we would access unless you were, of course, upper class. So again, very similar to the previous one, you could do this if you were a man only, but you would be an upper class man. So just add fencing to your table and then we can make some progress on this. It's quite a quick lesson, this one, really. It's more the comprehension that we'll spend some time with at the end of the lesson. This first part will just be giving you examples of things that people did in Elizabethan England. Okay, so then we have hunting on horseback with hounds. Men and women would do this, but still only the upper classes. I feel like that's very much the same as today, isn't it? There's a lot of controversy around hunting. People are protesting to ban fox hunting and things like that. It's quite violent and obviously very sad for the animals that are being hurt and killed by the chasers. However, this is something that the rich do today, as did they then. So hunting on horseback, obviously you'd send out the dogs, you'd shoot and you'd gather in your kill and either display it or eat it. So a nice event for loads of rich people to have a little day out together. Elizabeth, of course, did partake in this, as did most of the nobility, usually in their private lands. So it was happening in their own lands, so the poor people probably wouldn't even know it was happening. Okay, so add that one to your table, and then when we're ready, we can carry on. So hawking is a pastime that happens today for sure, but certainly not in the scale that it did in Elizabethan England. So men and women could hawk or go hawking to watch this thing or to do it. Usually probably it'd be the men doing it. but it was available to upper class people for their days out, or a little thing that they could go and watch or do. So they train these birds of prey, so birds like falcons, hawks and eagles sometimes. They would hunt smaller birds, obviously really brutal. These hunting birds have been specially trained to be brutal. Their talons and their beaks are sharpened. Some of the things they did to train the birds are really quite brutal. They'd steal them from the nest when they were babies or chicks. They would sew their eyelids down so they could be trained blind. And the hawkers would open their eyes with the string being pulled back. So really probably quite painful for the birds. But once they were trained, the show would go on, as they say, and you would go and watch these big birds of prey hunting and bringing back smaller birds. So again, quite sad and quite controversial for those animal lovers. But this is something that the upper classes did, men and women. So you can pop this into your table, and then when you're ready, we can move on. All right. Fishing was one that was done by men and women. Probably, again, similar to the hunting in the grounds of the nobility. You would need a license, I suppose. You can't, even today, you can't just go fishing, can you, in private lands? You could get caught and get in trouble. But this is what they would do. I would say probably, like today, more so men. But women could do it maybe to accompany their men friends or to take part. So a leisurely activity, you could say fishing is. But again, upper classes only. Probably because the poor wouldn't have access to the private lands where the rivers and lakes would be. I again imagine probably that poor people found a way somewhere, somehow, to have similar things like we do today, but generally speaking, access to fishing would be just for the upper classes. Okay, so as always, when you're ready, move forward, fill in your table. Bowls and skittles, you can see from this image on the screen here, it doesn't look quite as exciting as 10-pin bowling today, but I suppose the premise is the same. You're trying to knock over the skittles. People are obviously watching that. You can see it's a little bit upper class, shall we say. The players that they're playing music, they've got the harp, the violin, servants, it looks like as well. The way that they're dressed, it would definitely suggest this is something that upper class people are doing, and it absolutely would be. Again, without a shadow of a doubt, poor people would have some version of this, I'm sure, but as it goes, for this lesson, we would say upper class men only would do this, and the women might be there just to watch, but women would not do it. They wouldn't be bowling, trying to knock over the skittles. So this looks all right actually, as these things go. Looks kind of fun. A bit slower really than perhaps what you might expect today, as I say, in 10-pin bowling. But many rich people did this. Possibly some young boys as well would do this with their older male relatives or friends, just to get out and about. Okay, so when you're ready and you fill in your table with some details about this one, we will move on. So the next one is sport for all classes. Now it's important that you understand that although they could possibly be in the arena together, they wouldn't be sitting together. And certainly in this first example, wrestling, they wouldn't wrestle together, but they could go and watch wrestling in the same arena. So I suppose you'd find, as always, the rich would be sat above in the arena and the poor down below, or whatever. So your features of wrestling are men only. Obviously, this would just not be ladylike at all, would it? So the upper classes, generally, they wrestled in private. And the lower classes, they betted on more public matches. So you might see, I don't know, in the local villages, once or twice a week or once a month, whatever, a little event where the lower classes are wrestling each other, but it's public and bets take place. Like we've said, you could go and watch wrestling with all of the classes together, but you would not have a poor person wrestling a rich person, and vice versa. So with the craftsmen, the farmers and the labourers, so this would be an example of just the working class really, would be football. Now obviously football is the working class sport today, but it's very violent in Tudor times. Men were killed, so only men would play this. Interestingly, as you see this image, it looks like King Henry VIII is there watching. This looks quite an upper class version of it. You can obviously make out all sorts of stuff going on with stretchers coming on and lots of people watching. The tents would suggest this was an upper class gathering, but more so really football was for the working classes, so the craftsmen, the farmers and the labourers. So the rules were very different to football today. You could pick up the ball and run with it. You could have as many players as you wanted, and you could trip each other up and actually take people out, really. You might play this football in Tudor times would be played village to village, so a real rivalry between the local villages, and the violence, as I'm sure you can imagine. So the pitch can be any size, really. It could be the size of a village, just really violent. So there's loads of features for football that you could talk about if you got a features question. But try to sort of take yourself along the lines of, for the poorer, the working classes would do this sort of violent game. You just know the nobility would be having none of that. So football, interestingly, is quite a cool one because we obviously love football today, but not quite like this, perhaps. So spectator sports next. So this is generally things that you would watch. Okay, so today we go to watch football or darts or tennis or anything, things that you're not doing, but you're able to go and watch in an arena or in a stadium or something like that. Okay, so all classes for these first ones, that means they can all go. Again, the mixing of this in the arenas or the stadiums may well be that you would never cross paths with the rich, the upper classes with the lower classes. So the first one is baiting, which is, again, really, really violent, but the Tudors absolutely adored baiting. So several types of baiting. We'll start with burr baiting. So lots of money is bet on these things. They're building purpose-built arenas for burr baiting. As you can see there with the information or the feature of it, they break the teeth of the burrs so they can't bite the dogs, but the burr still often won. I suppose you're imagining there that they're just going to slap it with its almighty strength, knock the dog down, or slam it down and squash it down. These arenas were built specifically for this, but also it was important that the burrs didn't die, because the burrs are really, really expensive. So if it looks like the dogs were sort of overwhelming the burr and the dogs were about to win, the match would be called off and the dogs would be taken away. But it's sort of okay if the dogs died, though. So that's burr baiting, another really popular pastime where bets are massive bets. Obviously, the poor can't bet as much as the rich, but betting as a feature would still be something really valid that you could put in a question 1. Bull baiting, so I suppose similar to the matadors in Spain, the Tudors also loved a bit of bull baiting. This was a fight to the death this time, so the dogs would go up against chained bulls, and the winner was the one that was still alive, whereas remember we've said the burrs weren't really allowed to die. The bulls and the dogs could often be killed. In fact, they would be killed, and that would see the end of the match. So the dogs could be thrown high into the air or pierced with the bull's horns. Just really, really violent. Don't forget, though, the Tudor period and the medieval period in general is people used to go and watch public executions. So watching this kind of thing is probably just what they're used to. Okay, so we've got 2 examples of spectator sports where all classes could go and watch. All classes could bet on the outcomes, but they wouldn't be there together, certainly sitting next to each other. All right, and then the third example of this horrendously violent sport would be cockfighting. So you can see in this image here, again, purpose-built arenas would be made for cockfighting. The same kind of thing. Lots of bets would take place on this to see who would win. Again, you win by staying alive. So the cockerel that is killed first is defeated. They would sharpen the cockerel's beaks and their claws just to make this even more violent and excruciating. But it was a really, really popular spectator sport in Elizabethan England. She herself loved it. She was a big fan of cockfighting. However, the Puritans that we've sort of talked about in this course already, haven't we? We know that they're trying to purify life, get rid of any distractions at all from religion and from God. They hated this kind of thing, probably because it was fun, for starters, so that distraction thing they talk about, but also that the cockfighting usually happened on a Sunday, and they believed only that Sunday is a day of rest, a holy day, so they would often tut, shall we say, and maybe other forms of protest against cockfighting and the other events as well that caused people to have some fun. So there's loads of features for those last 3 spectator sports, so bear baiting, bull baiting, and cockfighting. If we got a question like that for question 1, that would be really, really nice. So make sure your tables are full of some of the details for those. Remember in the classes as well. And then less violent, more leisurely, shall we say, some pastimes. Now, generally this example we're going to talk about now would be for the educated, obviously, because they can read. However, remember from the medicine course, if you've studied medicine, or we have certainly, that the printing press has allowed lots more articles and literature to be about, some of it from the Royal Society. some of them from just books and things like that. So the access to these resources are much more available. And as we've seen in the education lesson, certainly for men, more people can read than before. So about 20% more men are being able to read by the end of Elizabeth's reign. So this is what's helping it. So the sort of rise of literature, if you like, there's loads of new things being published, whereas before they would have been handwritten by monks, who'd obviously be busy writing the works of Galen up. So history is really popular in this period, as it generally is today. People like hearing stories about the past, heroes and villains and things like that. This is what movies are based on, aren't they? Having a good guy and a bad guy and all those kinds of things. And people were no different back then. So they loved history. They loved hearing stories of Drake's voyages. So Drake is our pirate who attacks Spanish ships. So young noble boys, possibly in the petty schools, remember, they're hearing stories of these great, exciting voyages and journeys, and they're starting to be able to read them themselves. So that was something that would definitely be a thing growing up if you were an educated person. The Canterbury Tales, so the story, one of the most famous pieces of literature really in English history, is the story of medieval life in Canterbury in Kent, and those tales are popular today and were very popular back then as well. So most well-educated people, they also write and read a bit of poetry, and the plays that we're going to talk about in a sec, the theatre was booming and growing, so there was just a real desire for all of this new kind of entertainment really, and these pastimes much more accessible to much more people than ever before. Alright, so quite a nice easy pastime really for your table, and the knowledge that you could bring to it. We only need to remember one sentence to support this feature. So when you are ready and you've filled in your table, we can carry on. Alright, we've just mentioned the answer to that with the printing press really, so just add that perhaps to your table for a bit of a feature. This is what helped bring access to the masses. So music and dancing next. All classes loved music and dancing. Obviously we've seen some dancing at the court. Everyone loves music and dancing. I think today it's probably fair to say is that most of us like music. We listen to music on our phones or while we're milling about doing housework or whatever. We always generally have a bit of music on. Dancing when we're out. Certainly you guys will when you're a bit older. You'll enjoy dancing when you go out. It's just a bit of fun, isn't it? So all classes would dance and listen to music, although again, as always, not together. So the features of music and dance that we could think about in your table is that the Elizabethans were passionate about music. Instruments are obviously really expensive, so the poor would have limited access, if any, but the rich would have lutes and harpsichords. The harpsichord's sort of like a piano, and a lute's like a guitar. So they're so expensive you would only really find those instruments in a noble's home, but the poor, they would have fiddles and bagpipes, so they would have their fair share of music too. The rich would also, though, employ a musician to play during meals, and only men could be paid. I suppose if you go to a really expensive restaurant, you might have some music in the background, someone playing live music on a piano. I'm not sure we'd be seeing that kind of thing in McDonald's, would we? So again, that would symbolise just this idea of being upper class, having that kind of experience as you eat your dinner. The lower classes got most of their music at the fairs and the markets. I'm sure we've seen in your childhood so far, when you were younger, village fairs, things on the rec or the open fields. You might have been to a pub or a tavern where they've got music playing, or a pub today, not a tavern obviously, and music in the churches really. Barber shops might have some music playing. When you're getting your hair cut, they might have some music on. So that's really where the poor would have access to their music as well, very similar to today. And new music is being composed all the time to accompany these new plays in the growth of the Elizabethan theatres. Now, for your GCSE English, you should have, certainly by the time you get to your exams in Year 11, have some context to the Elizabethan theatres for the Shakespeare work that you do. So that would help just bring these two subjects together a little bit. So bring your knowledge from English and take this knowledge to English when you're thinking about the context of the Shakespeare theatre and the Elizabethan theatre as well. All right. Dancing, of course, brings men and women together. That's possibly where they might meet or catch each other's eye, especially the poor people when they meet on a field and they gaze across the field or the rec and they see someone that they might be interested in. Obviously, though, just to clarify once again, they would not be dancing with other classes. All right, so hopefully you've got plenty there as well in your table regarding the features of music and dance. Loads of information We only need a little bit of supporting information, remember. Okay, so let's spend some time now, a little bit more detail on the Elizabethan theatre. All right, so this new entertainment, like absolutely goes wild. Really, really popular, really, really quickly. All classes can go to the theatre, but as always, they would not mix at the theatre. And if they did brush past each other, shoulder to shoulder, you can imagine the upper classes looking down their noses, perhaps. But generally speaking, they could go to the theatre, all of them, and watch the show. Just a little warning for now, please. If you are watching this and you are doing Edexcel, Elizabethan England, please, in your exams, do not mention William Shakespeare. You can talk about theatres and everything you know about theatres, but don't talk about Shakespeare, as he is in the 1590s and our course stops in 1588. Remember, it's really important in the technique of our exam questions that we stay within the date range of the questions. So just a little warning there, in the Elizabeth course for Edexcel, don't mention Shakespeare. So let's have some information then we could add about the theatres. Now this could be if they asked us more of an essay question, so the 12 or the 16 marker. This is perhaps the knowledge that we'd need to recall. So they are, as we've said at the very beginning, and with the education lesson, the rise of Protestantism, the idea that they want people to be able to read, to understand the Bible and have this relationship with God, this has influenced the theatres as well. So these mystery plays, that's what used to happen. They were really common, and they basically brought the stories from the Bible to life. But the Protestants believe that this is a way that the Catholics could control interpretations and the messages, a little bit like sort of, I guess, trying to stop messages getting out there, a little bit like maybe the Nazis did with the Gestapo and the licenses and things. And we'll see in a sec that you also needed a license in Elizabethan England to write a play, but maybe a bit of censorship perhaps. But the Protestants are just worried that the Catholic plays, these mystery plays from the Bible, would, I don't know, influenced what people thought. And Elizabeth was also concerned that these mystery plays could encourage religious violence. Now we know, don't we, from the whole religious settlement story, that she is trying really hard to keep a sort of level playing field. But as we get into the 60s and 70s, as you know from the rest of this course, the religious violence does rise, the plots increase, don't they? And that's really the reason probably why Elizabeth does introduce the license to anyone writing a play. So in essence, what that led to was the mystery plays were stopped and they were replaced by non-religious plays instead. So comedies instead, really, they were really, really popular in Elizabethan England. It's really interesting and quite good to think about. Some of you may watch stand-up shows, some of you may have a bit of a limit on who you watch, some of these comedians. Some of them push the boat quite far, don't need to what they say in the name of entertainment and comedy. Some are really sort of tame. But it was the same back then. But the people of Elizabethan England, they were actually quite vulgar. They swore a lot. They liked crude jokes. They were quite rude. They had a dark sense of humour. So the comedies that were being written, were really very entertaining. What we'd call stand-up today. So there's also this new demand for non-religious plays. Obviously, if you think about it, they know what's happening, don't they, in the mystery plays, because they know the Bible stories. So these new plays were more exciting because they didn't know the end. So that was quite cool as well. So that encouraged people to go to the theatres as well. But especially the comedies mixed up with this Tudor vulgarity would have been something they liked quite a lot. The Puritans, though, let's pop them back in again, just whinging and moaning and tutting as usual. They hate the theatre. They hate the theatre, as we've said, for everything else because it is a distraction from God. It's fun, but also they're a little bit concerned about it spreading diseases. That's what they'd whinge about. Oh, everyone's at the theatre passing on the plague. And they're probably not wrong in that sense, are they? But they were there moaning, saying that people were idle. They weren't doing God's work if they're watching and laughing at plays. They're the work of the devil. These are the things that the Puritans would be outside the theatres protesting about. Just constantly a nuisance, really. Interestingly, though, we know, don't we, that Leicester is quite a strong Protestant, shall we say, on the way towards Puritan. But he creates his own leisure company, his own theatre company as well, which we'll talk about in a sec. So this has given you loads of information at this part of the lesson that you need to try and get into your table or separate notes if you like. I would almost recommend that the theatre should be taken as its own standalone bit of fun because there's a lot more detail to it. And this will obviously help you as well in your, as I've said, GCSE English for some context of what's going on in this period when you are doing your Shakespeare section. So, as we've mentioned previously, the censorship of the theatre, if we think about 1572, it's important to remember that in 1571 was the Ridolfi plot, in 1570 was the excommunication, in 1569 was the Northern Rebellion, and in 1568 Mary Queen of Scots arrived in England. So it probably should come as no surprise to you that by 1572 Elizabeth is getting a little bit more concerned about the Catholic threat. So that's why she's done this. So all companies who write a script need to have a license, and they have to present their script before the government before they're ever performed. Very much the same as in Nazi Germany. Any art, music, or paintings, remember, they needed to get passed through the ministry. So that's a nice little link back to that as well. So this section of the lesson now is again just going to give you loads of facts. It'd be really helpful if you knew them all, but again, you don't need to, because when we are saying a feature of Elizabethan entertainment would be the theatre, you just need to support that with a little bit of knowledge, and some of this will be plenty. So we'll just go through it a little bit. Obviously, you can read yourself and add these to your notes. It might be worth doing this as a little mind map with some dual coding, some little images to go with the notes, just to break this bit up. But let's get started then on the features of the Elizabethan theatre. So as we've talked about this demand, obviously there's a lot of money to be made. People want it. So they built theatres purposely for the theatre, for the plays. Most of these in London, obviously, because that is the place to be. All right, so only men are allowed to act. Women's parts are taken by boys. You may know that from your English introduction to the Shakespearean period. Sometimes they were accused of up to 2,000 people if it's a particularly popular play, or it's got a bit of a buzz around it. Just like what happens today in the West End, if there's a particularly good show, you know it's really, really popular, or a movie in the cinema. We've seen the queues around the building, haven't we? So again, really, really similar. Poor people, this is why it's so popular, is because they can access this thing. They could pay 1 penny to stand in the pit, which is right at the front of the stage. Probably good seats, really. If you were at a theatre today, or a show today, or a concert, being right at the front would be quite good, wouldn't it? So they can pay a penny to go, which it's not like really cheap, but they could certainly save up that, like we could today. You know, if you wanted to go to an event in a couple of weeks, you could probably save a couple of pounds and you'd have enough. So it was definitely accessible to the poor, let's say, than some of the other pastimes we've looked at today in this lesson. So the most important seats, and this bit's sort of standing out a little bit, just for context again, is directly above the stage. Now we know, don't we, in theatres today, that the bits above the stage, looking down, are generally where the rich would sit and watch. It's not the best view, but it was more important for these rich people that you, as a poor person, saw them. They weren't even that bothered about the play. They were just more worried that you can see them, that you can see that they're above you, and that everyone's attention is on them. Bit of a weird thing to do, really, but hey-ho, that is what they did. So they would sit above. It was more important that they were seen than what they were seeing. I don't know, I don't think most poor people really gave two hoots about them. They were too busy watching the show or laughing at the comedy. It was a good day out, obviously, like things are today. If you went away with your family or you go to the pantomime at Christmas, it's a good laugh. Food, drink, loads of cheering, loads of booing, and as we've said, the entrance fee is relatively cheap too. So a lovely day out for the family that everybody can have access to. One of the first theatres to be built in 1576, which obviously, as we've said, is in our date range, so we can talk about it. Luckily, it's called the theatre, so by accident, you could probably get that fact in there. And then we've got the curtain, and then we've got the rose. But we don't want to be mentioning really the globe. The most famous of all is the globe, but remember, we know that that's Shakespeare's. And Elizabeth has got her own theatre group called the Queen's Men, and the Earl of Leicester had Leicester's Men. So obviously the upper classes and the nobility have a little bit more, I suppose, invested in these things. They're the ones building the theatres, aren't they? But like I said before, interesting that Leicester is potentially Robert Dudley, that is, a Puritan. Interesting that he chooses to enjoy this particular pastime. So this little image on the screen now just kind of summarises what we've just said there in that last part of the lesson. I feel like it would be a useful opportunity just to maybe pause the video and do that mind map with the dual coding of some of those details and features. And again, some of these here you can see just for the visual of it. So we're talking about the galleries. This is where the rich people sat. The pit, where you'd pay a penny to get in there. That's where the poor people would generally be crammed in. Again, not mixing with anybody else. The stage where the actors perform. You can see you'll have done something like this definitely in your English lessons as well. All right, and then above the gallery seats, you can see where they would be on show to everybody not particularly seeing the play. All right, so that's a nice little visual to summarize what we've just spoken about. So this is what you should have done now. As we've gone through this lesson, you should generally have your table. Hopefully your table's a lot more detailed than the one that you can see on the screen right now. But what we would recommend that you do now, it's a really good activity just to make sure that we are covered for any eventuality of a question relating to this, is go through each of the activities that we've talked about in this lesson and do a question 1 for each of them. So start with one feature of Elizabethan leisure was hunting, and then add some supporting detail about that. So you'd obviously talk about the classes that can do it, the genders that can do it, and any other information that you think is important. Then do it again for fencing, tennis, wrestling, all the way down. This is obviously going to take you probably half an hour or so, because it really is about a 2 or 3 minute job for each question 1, isn't it? But as a revision exercise, we would absolutely nail on being able to answer any question they ask us in the exam. So pause this video when you are going to do that, or go away and do it yourself after the video, but that would be a really, really good way to practice. This whole lesson really could be a lovely mind map with some dual coding, some little images, just to bring it all together, ideally on one page. Perhaps you could do a nice little revision poster of entertainment or leisure in Elizabethan England. So just to then think about, before we finish this lesson, an interpretations practice, obviously for paper 3, so for us it would be the Germany paper. Anytime we can practice these interpretations is a good thing. So have a little read of interpretation 1. Right, what is the view of interpretation 1 relating to progress in Elizabethan England? So you're obviously going to say the view of interpretation 1 is that something, something, something related to progress. And then you'll say, I can tell this because it says, and then you pick out a sentence. And then maybe give a little bit more thought to everything that we've talked about in the lessons on education and entertainment. Do you agree with interpretation 1 that things have progressed? There's lots of good stuff. Remember in the education lesson, we talked a little bit about that being a 12 marker or a 16 marker, saying that there was progress in education. Do you agree? A difficult topic, a difficult question it would be, but they could ask us this. So it makes sense, doesn't it, to practice it. So do you agree with interpretation 1? And that's obviously good practice as well for the Germany paper 3 20 marker, when you're asked which interpretation you agree with the most. Okay, so with that said, once again, thank you very much for listening to this video. Hopefully it's given you enough, or certainly it's given you enough. Hopefully you found it interesting though, just to compare leisure and entertainment today to the Tudor period. Remember, all of our lessons are on stchistory.com, online live video lessons and the PowerPoints and other resources too. So thank you very much, and we will see you again next time. Take care, goodbye.